So in Book 7 of the Republic, Plato, this guy here, gives us one of the greater metaphors of Western culture that then is supposed to show us something about the nature of, as he says, man's education and his need for education and the lack thereof. So what does that metaphor of the cave actually say? Well, he says that there's a cave in which there are people imprisoned, shackled in their hands and their feet to the earth. The shackles are of iron, and they are held prisoner there, like miners would be in the ancient world. So these people are like prisoners here in this womb, this cathedral. So here these people are shackled to the earth in this cave, and they're crouched down in the dark, and they're viewing on this wall beyond them these images, these shadows that pass by as they watch. The shadows are created by a fire way back behind them, and this fire burns very brightly over a little low wall. People pass between the wall and the fire, and they carry images on their heads, and they talk to one another as they go. And in the echoes of the cave, and in the shadows that are cast on the wall, we have something that mimics life. It's like as though they were watching life, shadowy images of life, and the sounds that they hear, they associate with those images. Plato is saying these are thaumatopoi, things of wonder. And the word references back to something earlier in the text, which is that thaumatos means wonder. And thaumatazzo is to wonder at something or marvel at something. Like he saw the cave and he marveled at it and he went down. He wondered at it. Wonder is the basis of all philosophy, as Aristotle says. Well, Plato goes on to say that these people who are seeing this show and are hearing these sounds, they mistake the sounds and the show for the really real. But what if, at one point, one of the characters had his chain suddenly broken? He doesn't explain why this would happen, but what if he had his chain suddenly broken? And his connection to that world of the cave, whatever it was suddenly severed. His umbilical cord was suddenly severed. And he turns and he looks at the light and he wonders at it. Thaumatazzo. He wonders at it. And he goes up to see, what is that light up there? What is that fire up there? And he moves towards the fire and he sees all the shapes of the people carrying on their heads. And he sees beyond that light, as his eyes are growing accustomed to it, and he looks and he says, there's light at the entrance of this cave. I'm in a cave, and there's a light at the entrance of the cave. And he tries to move towards that light. And as he does so, he finds that this climb up the cave is arduous, it's difficult. And he begins to say, maybe it's better in the cave. But at that point, somebody comes and grabs him and drags him up out of the cave. Well, and he drags the person, almost kicking and screaming, out of the cave. Reluctantly is the word Plato says. He goes reluctantly out of the cave. The pilgrim doesn't want to leave the cave, and so someone else, some unnamed person, Plato would say it's the philosopher, comes down and takes that person, takes him by the arm and drags them out. And drags them out to the world where their eyes they hurt at first to the light. Oh, this light's too bright. I can't stand this. But, as Plato says, they first begin to see shadows of things, looking at the ground. They see reflections in the water. They see shadows on the ground. And they begin to recognize these things. Oh, these are real. And then they begin to look up and they see the things making those shadows, those reflections, the trees and the birds around them, other things on the earth, on the surface of the earth. And then they begin to be able to look up towards the light of the stars and the moon at night time, because it's easier on the eyes. And at last they're able to look and they say, there's the sun itself. And they look right into the sun and they can see it, and it's dazzling. Well, having seen the sun itself, there's nothing more that the pilgrim can see. And so what happens to him is that he suddenly has this great urge to go back and tell everybody else, to go back and help them out. In this case, one who has seen the sun goes back to the cave because he remembers those in the cave, and he's obligated to go back and draw them back out. It's out of love, really, that he does this. So he goes back down into the cave, and his eyes hurt because it's dark down there, and this descent has hurt him. So he goes back into the cave, and because his eyes are dark, he doesn't recognize the shadows on the wall the way the others do. Now, he's in a better state because his eyes have been opened, his heart has been opened, his mind has been opened. But his eyes are closed to the dim things that people still appreciate down there in the dark of the cave. And consequently, he's not good at naming things because, of course, those people down there in the cave, out of boredom or whatever, were spending time naming all the objects as they passed by. They knew all the stats of the objects. They knew all the players. They knew all the details of the actors in the movies, They were able to recognize all those little things that pertain to this object or that object. And they gave out prizes for being able to recognize such things. And Plato says, if that's the case, if you came back down into the dark and you didn't recognize as easily as others what these things stood for, you'd be laughed at, you'd be ridiculed. That's what happens to the person who goes back down into the cave. Their eyes are open to larger, better, more beautiful things. And because of that, their eyes have a hard time recognizing what's down there in the cave. And if he were to try and tell other people that there are better things, Plato says, what would happen to him? He'd be ridiculed, he'd be laughed at. Eventually he'd be seen as a nuisance. He might be attacked, beat up, even killed, crucified. Because he's such a nuisance. He takes away from, Sunday night football. And that, Plato says, that ultimately is the end of the metaphor of the cave. That this fellow who has gone down into the cave ends up being ridiculed and eventually destroyed. Here are the actual words from Book 7. Compare the effect of education and of the lack of it on our nature to an experience like this. Imagine human beings living in an underground cave-like dwelling with an entrance a long way up, which is both open to the light and as wide as the cave itself. They've been there since childhood, fixed in the same place, with their necks and legs fettered, able to see only in front of them because their bonds prevent them from turning their heads around. Light is provided by a fire burning far above and behind them. Also behind them, but on higher ground, there is a path stretching between them and the fire. Imagine that along this path a low wall has been built, like the screen in front of puppeteers above which they show their puppets. Also imagine that there are people along the wall, carrying all kinds of artifacts that project above it. Statues of people and other animals, made out of stone, wood, and every material. And as you'd expect, some of the carriers are talking, and some are silent. Do you suppose, first of all, that these prisoners see anything of themselves and one another besides the shadows that the fire casts on the wall in front of them? What about the things being carried along the wall? isn't the same true of them? And if they could talk to one another, don't you think they'd suppose that the names they used applied to the things they see passing before them? And what if their prison also had an echo from the wall facing them? Don't you think they'd believe that the shadows passing in front of them were talking whenever one of the carriers passing along the wall was doing so? Then the prisoners would in every way believe that the truth is nothing other than the shadows of those artifacts. Consider then what being released from their bonds and cured of their ignorance would naturally be like, if something like this came to pass. When one of them was freed and suddenly compelled to stand up, turn his head, walk, and look up toward the light, he'd be pained and dazzled and unable to see the things whose shadows he'd seen before. What do you think he'd say if we told him that what he'd seen before was inconsequential, and that now, because he is a bit closer to the things that are, and is turned towards things that are more, he sees more correctly? Or to put it another way, if we pointed to each of the things passing by, asked him what each of them is, and compelled him to answer, don't you think he'd be at a loss, and that he'd believe that the things he saw earlier were truer than the ones he was now being shown? And if someone compelled him to look at the light itself, wouldn't his eyes hurt, and wouldn't he turn around and flee towards the things he's able to see, believing that they're really clearer than the ones he's being shown? And if someone dragged him away from there by force up the rough, steep path, and didn't let him go until he had dragged him into the sunlight, wouldn't he be pained and irritated at being treated that way? And when he came into the light with the sun filling his eyes, wouldn't he be unable to see a single one of the things now said to be true? I suppose then that he'd need time to get adjusted before he could see things in the world above. At first he'd see shadows most easily, then images of men and other things in water, and then the things themselves. Of these he'd be able to study the things in the sky, and the sky itself more easily at night, looking at the light of the stars and the moon, than during the day, looking at the sun and the light of the sun. Finally, I suppose, he'd be able to see the sun, not images of it in water or some alien place, but the sun itself, in its own place, and be able to study it. And at this point, he would infer and conclude that the sun provides the seasons and the years, governs everything in the visible world, and is in some way the cause of all the things that he used to see. What about when he reminds himself of his first dwelling place, his fellow prisoners, and what passed for wisdom there? Don't you think that he'd count himself happy for the change and pity the others? And if there had been any honors, praises, or prizes among them for the one who was sharpest at identifying the shadows as they passed by, and who best remembered which usually came earlier and which later and which simultaneously, and who could thus best divine the future, do you think that our man would desire these rewards or envy those among the prisoners who were honored and held power? Instead, wouldn't he feel, with Homer, that he'd much prefer to work the earth as a serf to another one without possessions, and go through any sufferings, rather than share their opinions and live as they do? If this man went down into the cave again, and sat down in his same seat, Wouldn't his eyes coming suddenly out of the sun like that be filled with darkness? Before his eyes had recovered, and the adjustment would not be quick, while his vision was still dim, if he had to compete again with perpetual prisoners in recognizing the shadows, wouldn't he invite ridicule? Wouldn't it be said of him that he'd returned from his upward journey with his eyesight ruined, and that it isn't worthwhile even to try to travel upward? And as for anyone who tried to free them, lead them upward, if they could somehow get their hands on him, wouldn't they kill him? This whole image, Glaucon, must be fitted together with what we said before. The visible realm should be likened to the prison dwelling, and the light of the fire inside it to the power of the sun. And if you interpret the upward journey and the study of things above as the upward journey of the soul to the intelligible realm, you'll grasp what I hope to convey, since that is what you wanted to hear about. Whether it's true or not, only the God knows.